There's two fish in a tank. One of them turns to the other and says, "Do you know how to drive this thing?"
That's funny. Mine is a fish joke too that my grandfather told me when I was pretty young. The fish swims into a concrete wall. He says, "Damn."
Oh.
That's awesome. That's awesome. My daughter told me one the other day. She said, Apple was going to make electric cars, but they have no windows.
Precocious.
Yeah, this is
welcome to the podcast, Maggie. Why don't you do an introduction of yourself and then we'll dive into something interesting.
Sure. Conference voice. My name is Maggie MacAlpine. I'm the cyber engagement lead at MITRE Ingenuity for the Center for Threat Informed Defense. Before that, I was Sam Curry's chief of staff / security strategist at Cybereason. Before that,
she did all the real work. She did. All the real work.
I did all the conference talks that Sam was too busy to do. His days were already 18 hours. We were just desperately trying to get them down to 16, just to be fair to him. And then before that, I was at a bunch of startups, including my own consultancy, and we did a lot of election security work for consulting or pro bono as well over the years. And before that is college, where I was an English major, which naturally leads into all of this.
Who happened to speak Italian, as I recall.
Happens to speak Italian, yes. I lived overseas for a few years, and it was utter hell. And out of that hell, I learned basically like the most broken Italian you've ever heard. But I can get around still. So,
that's all that matters, right? That's So do you still have a passion for election security? Is that still a deep and abiding thing, or is it something you're going to return to?
I always feel the need. This is a nerdy enough podcast that I can quote this. Like, I will always be interested in election security because, to quote Rocket Raccoon from Guardians of the Galaxy about like, why would you save the world? I'm one of the idiots who lives here. Actually, Star-Lord says that to him. But I'm one of the idiots who lives in this country. So yes, I would like to continue to see our elections be safe, secure, free and fair. But I am not as up to date. So generally speaking, these days, if somebody asks me, I kind of come on. I'm willing to do like a level set. I'm willing to kind of say like what the state of it's a very slow moving industry. So the one thing I kind of pull back from is saying like what's being done these days. I don't want to disparage it when hard work is going on or say hard work's happening if it has stalled for some reason. But I can kind of tell people like what was the situation at least up until 2020.
But I feel that way about a lot of things. I think there's a temptation to call yourself an expert, and there comes a point, and it's hard to know when it's past, when you no longer are. And two really weird things happen. You find yourself in a room and you realize you still have a depth that is applicable, and yet maybe imposter syndrome steps in or something. You feel like you're not on the cutting edge anymore. You can get back into it pretty quickly, but there's like a best before. Or rather, there's a date after which you feel like your cutting edgeness has expired. And I'm very careful about that because certainly when you're chief information security officer, you got to remember you're not supposed to be the best security person in the room anymore, right? The people under you are supposed to be. Did you feel that way too, Maggie?
Certainly with election security, 2020 was such a like sort of a grenade thrown into that world, and a lot has changed as a result of the highest office in the land getting involved in election integrity, shall we say, in various ways.
Alleged various ways.
In various ways. So there's always lawsuits. There's like everything in the United States, everything's built on precedent. So there could be precedents that have changed. A lot of vendors who were hostile to things like the voting village were starting to come around. Right towards the end of 2020 to like wanting to work with independent researchers rather than spurning them or suing them. So a lot of states, there's a lot of furor around election security these days. So states could be channeling that money towards things that actually help, or they could be channeling it towards, posturing and things that disenfranchise voters. on the assumption that voter fraud, which is statistically negligible to the point of non-existent, gets tackled instead, right? Like that would be one way I would be like, I don't want to say like, oh, it's so slow moving. Like nobody's got an IT guy in voting security, in these small states, these small municipalities. But only to find out, like, actually, the situation tilted since then. Now everybody's got one, or most have got one, except for a few remote areas. So, like, and again, you just don't want to disparage the work that might be going on behind your back. Like, there could have been a huge inrush of things I just don't know about, and I don't want to be like, oh, it's never going to happen. These things are so slow. These initiatives that weren't going anywhere, and to find out like they were going somewhere and they're clipping along. So
you mentioned the voting village.
Yeah,
I assume most people aren't familiar with that, and for those that listen that haven't gone to conferences might not even be familiar with the idea of villages in general.
Yeah, so villages, at least in my deepest experience, are like small, almost conferences within a conference. DEF CON, the largest hacker conference, I believe, at least in the United States, has them, and they'll have like hardware hacking or biohacking, or you can basically kind of bring your topic of choice there. You can actually establish your own village. Though there's a little bit of a barrier to entry, it can't be frivolous. But the voting village was designed specifically to address voting machine concerns, which had been raised around 2005 by a group including Ron Rivest of RSA and various luminaries and cybersecurity people who were really concerned because of the influx of digital voting machines brought on by the Help America Vote Act in 2002. So anyway, they realized all these things are electronic now, and they went, well, these things might be hackable. So they began to work on this problem and found some very disturbing things, which are all outlined in an HBO documentary called Hacking Democracy. That crew went on, including the hacker in that, who is Harry Hursty, who is my former business partner, to continue to address these concerns. And one of the things that came out of that in 2017 was the voting machine hacking village, where finally... keep in mind, DMCA regulations were used to prevent voting machine research by independent experts. They were black box. They were considered protected. That lifted, thanks to a lot of campaigning by some really smart, amazing people like Matt Blaze of Georgetown Law. And so finally we could do this thing. And we could host these voting machine hacking events. And that was the purpose of this village, this conference within a conference at DEF CON, which drew a lot of attention and was a really, really great effort and kind of moved the needle forward on independent research and security research being done by voting machine vendors in the United States.
It's crazy how long it took to get laws in place that were logical. Like, saying no doesn't stop a hacker. And for the longest time, that was instead of having policies on how we address the technical issues or policies how we address procedural issues, like, we wrote a law that says you can't do it. We've solved the problem.
Stop.
Computer fraud.
Stop again. Yeah.
Right. Do you think that's actually changed, or you seem to think it has changed, but
there's, I think the public opinion has changed enough now let me be clear. Any company probably would like to stay out of the press for their product not working. And election companies, election product creators, vendors have some, I will lend them this. Elections are a very unique threat space because the appearance of an attack can be as damaging as an actual attack. You can't say that about like everything. You can't say that if I, say I hacked your pacemaker, you're as in danger as if I actually hacked it. Like, it's pretty black or white. Did you hack it or not? Is it going to kill me or let me die? With a voting machine, it's such a trust-based world. So I don't entirely blame them for being careful with, wild claims, with not wanting to let just any guy off the street, just hack their voting machines and say, I found this vulnerability. As you know, not all vulnerabilities are going to be exploited. In fact, most vulnerabilities we find have not been exploited, as far as we know. Or if they do, they're not critical, or they'll be caught in some other way. And that can be lost in the headlines, and election space in particular is incredibly vulnerable to that and can disenfranchise voters by creating the appearance of an attack. So on the other hand, though, they didn't have to sue like students and, professors and doctors and researchers, doctors of technology and stuff. I mean, it's just, there was a lot of antipathy, a lot of animosity between voting machine vendors and scholars, and hackers and computer scientists at one point, which came from, an excessive zeal, I would say, in trying to protect that, and again, try to keep themselves out of the headlines with anything that could be damaging. And it's like, sorry, this is actually bigger than you. We actually do need to address, and we don't trust that you're actually doing the work to keep these things safe on the level they need to be safe for the threats that we're facing. You're not, the DoD. You're some of these vendors are so much smaller than you even realize. Like, it's terrifying how small some of them are. They don't have the place, there wasn't necessarily the need or the motivation or even the money in some cases for them to have the security that they needed. So that was kind of like what some of this pressure was meant to do, was be like, now you actually got to do this, even if it's uncomfortable or difficult or expensive. So
now, Maggie, you and I think the first time we interacted professionally was actually during a tabletop of an election hacking event. Because what we had done, we were I think it was the 7th one, and it was during quarantine, if I'm not mistaken.
It's 2020.
And we were mixing tabletop sort of gaming out with a red team, blue team around an election event. Mm-hmm. And I was part of the team organizing it. It was me and a guy named Bill Keeler. And I think you were on the red team.
Yes, I was on the red team with Jonathan.
Was my brother on that team too?
I think he might have been on the blue
team. Yeah, that's possible.
That doesn't seem right.
Maybe
you can't put red on the blue.
His name's Red.
His name's Red.
On the red team, but
no, it gets worse than that. Sorry, Sam. What's his full name?
Red Curry.
We've done it once or twice.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right.
You get reservations at some restaurants and stuff, and we're gonna have to have him on here too at some point. But back to you. So how did you get involved in that? I don't think I ever understood how you found us or we found you.
I hacked my way in. That was the challenge, wasn't it? No. Actually, I had done with Highwire PR. I had done a panel which included people like Baccio of Splunk, who was at the time the CSO of the Buttigieg campaign, and Michael Daniel of the Cyber Threat Alliance, and I had just somehow ended up in their little kind of roster.
We're all sort of in the same circle anyway, with Ari Schwartz and everybody else. Yeah,
and then. I guess they were just looking for people for these things. Election security was topical because it was 2020, the fall, and I said, sure.
I was really worried about how that would be doing it over Zoom for the first time.
Yeah.
And I remember I was sitting on my back deck thinking, this is so surreal that I've got 30 people in a simulation. Ed Davis was in it, and who was the former police commissioner for Boston and during the Boston Marathon bombing, actually, and a bunch of others. And I remember you were there and you were part of a team. And did the team come together well, even though it was over Zoom? Or did it not? You can say
I thought so. I actually, my little smile was because I thought the red team did very well, but we were declared the losers for reasons that still left a scar in my soul.
Mad at with me?
I'm still mad about it because I thought we actually won.
I think a rematch is required for that, right? That's I think we need a rematch is what you're saying.
I think we need to relitigate it a little bit because the thing that they said we had lost on was that we didn't first that we didn't change the outcome. And we were told explicitly at the beginning that our goal was not to change the outcome. So that was a little boo. But the second thing was they said all you did was convince 30% of the losing party that the other candidate won. And therefore that's not
being some go back and look at the record for that. By the way, it's really hard for us to do that. It's because we actually removed all the material from online. It drew attention from misinformation and disinformation groups that were looking to cause trouble in 2021 and 2022. So we actually took it all offline because we'd done 7 or 8 of those by that point.
Oh, I don't blame you at all. It got really crazy there. Maybe still is. But basically I was in the spring after, I kind of got over it. I was whatever. Yeah, it's red team, blue team. I don't care. But then the spring after when let's just say maybe about 30% of the losing party thought that they had rightfully won, I was this is exactly what we did. This is exactly what the scenario said we accomplished. And you guys said it wasn't a big deal. This is a massive deal.
So you get a
so history vindicated us. Yeah.
You get post-facto points on that one.
Yeah.
Have you been involved in anything like that since, or is it something you've been pulled into at all?
Not really. I parted ways with the Voting Village around the time I joined Cybereason, and so I haven't done anything in that space. I would love to get involved in that sort of thing, but no, I have not been invited again. So that was a very fun, but now somewhat singular opportunity.
And so now you're MITRE Ingenuity, right?
Yes.
And so what pulled you in that direction?
There's a few answers to that. First, that they reached out to me. That helped. But largely, so the election security world, as I kind of like mentioned glancingly, is a very integrity-based world. Like it really is. You don't want to be seen as a vendor. That's kind of a dirty word, even more so than in like broader cybersecurity. You're not. You don't want to be seen as sort of like out for yourself. It's a very like nonprofit, sort of dominated place. So I have always been very careful with my integrity. Like I'm not saying I would never like sell a product, but it would have to be a product I believe in because that kind of like set the state, like they set the level for me about like what kind of person I wanted to be in the cybersecurity world. It was that like that honesty, that integrity, that not being seen as a snake oil salesman. So when MITRE reached out to me, I definitely had a moment of like, oh, this is like a mission that's good. I mean, MITRE Attack Framework. These are people working on important problems. It's not sleazy. It's not a snake oily kind of thing. This is at the very least, this is a mission that I would be proud to be a part of. And it would be a nice thing to dip out of vendor space for a little bit and at least try this world out.
The word mission is critical there, I think.
Yes.
Right? Integrity is like, it's a without which nothing, right? A sine qua non. It's like a base, but it's why do you do it isn't just financial motivation. In fact, it's about leadership and giving back. And I think that was probably the most, you said a lot of things, but that's one of the most important words that came out there. Right. And I think mission's been motivating you for a long time. Personally, I mean, it's certainly, I feel it behind the election stuff. I felt it when we worked together. Oh. You gravitated towards the things that were mission oriented or that made a difference for the community. And I suspected that the sort of MITRE coming up with method. What I've always liked about the attack framework, for instance, is that it's iterative, it's improving, it's getting better. I hate to use the word academic, but it has a rigor to it. And if that's not the right terminology, please correct me because I'm not.
No, I think
as stupid as you, right? And then there's is it the engage framework that came after it? What are the techniques for dealing with each? Maybe I've got the role.
Defend is the one you're thinking
Defend.
of.
I thought there was another name. They just changed names recently or something. But it seems like they're always trying to improve the state of the art and the craft for practitioners, which is really meaningful.
Yeah, I think that they have a uniquely effective place, sort of as being this sort of nonprofit, this sort of institution of a nonprofit. In that, like, even a very well-intentioned vendor might need to change what they're working on because of market forces. They might we put this out for free, but we just can't anymore. We got to charge for it. Or like we were working on ransomware and therefore putting out all these tools for the community for that, but now we're not. So like we've pivoted and we're not maintaining those anymore. Those aren't anybody's fault. There's no moral judgment attached. It's just the realities of being in a private business. And that academic, which you refer to as MITRE, I think is very fitting because it is like, there's things that need to be done for and by the wider community that no one company can be responsible for, that shouldn't be paywalled, that are, this common language, for example, with MITRE Tech Framework are really important and key and really effective. And I don't know if anybody else, any individual, any private company could really do it the same way.
Right. I don't think there's any shame in charging cost or even cost plus a small markup because that's not necessarily profit, but that enables scale. Right. It's, you can do it on a far bigger scale for more people and carry the service through to more people and then do more research. I think MITRE stands for MIT Research Establishment. Isn't that what it stands for?
There is controversy around this question.
Oh, okay. So you can blame me for that one.
MITRE, yeah. There's one theory I heard that it was MITRE, which is like a research, something, engineering. And then there's another version where they specifically wanted a word that meant nothing, but apparently hadn't had a dictionary on hand because it does actually mean something.
It does mean
I've heard many theories.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the archivist said that, yes, it was they had a placeholder name that was MIT. And then the other one was RE, the other company, maybe I think it's a RAND forebearer or something that had combined to make them. And they had planned to make a new name. And a few months in, they were like, oh, we'd have to change all the paperwork and we just don't want to. And it was in the 60s. So they kept the placeholder name. This is why, by the way, you should never put a placeholder name if it's a name that could possibly be the real thing. It will always stay. Yes. So I lost track of the thread.
No, that's
Can we go back to academic for a second?
Academic, yeah.
Yeah, just the phrasing itself. Because I think one of the things MITRE Attack does really, really well is help create a framework that actually drives a practical security program.
Yes.
So one of the challenges that bothers me in the industry all the time is this ideology of what perfection is and trying to achieve perfection in security. But and it's not a reality. And so to get a business to do something reasonable around security, to achieve a mission of protecting people, we have to have very practical ways to apply research in academia. Because if you take the principles of, say, like a volume of this big of the principles of encryption and try to turn that into a business practice, it just doesn't go well. But with the MITRE attack framework, in my opinion, you can do this very practical analysis of, here's the technologies I have, here's the ways I could be attacked, so here's the ways I can focus on defense, and then align that to business priorities. However, do you feel that? Do you feel it is more practical than what a traditional academic? When you hear the word academic, you think of it as a very lofty study, right? A very highbrowed study versus, to me, attack seems very practical. It's very grounded.
Yeah.
It's got an ampersand in there, right? So there's definitely marketing involved.
It's got marketing involved.
So yeah, I was going to say, I'm just reminded of that one XKCD comic where they talk about like computer science in academia, which is like, it's beautiful, it's perfect. It's these 4 lines of code that achieve so much. Nobody's ever done this before. And then like computer science in the real world and corporate world, it's like, great. Can you get our emails to work already? Like,
right. So do you think MITRE hits that well? Do you agree that it does? Because from my perspective, as an end user,
I feel like I'm like contractually obligated to say yes, but no, but I'm joking. I've never not been charged to say anything, but I would say I would, it's also an enormous organization, so I can't speak to every mission, but I would say that, like, for example, the Center for Threat Informed Defense, which I do now. One of the reasons it was spun up was because private companies were coming to work with MITRE on research projects. And they would get these whole teams together, and there'd be enormous overhead and like administrative things. And then it would all have to like kind of be wound down afterwards. It'd have to be dissolved. And it was kind of a shame. It's a lot of wasted effort. So the idea, one of the reasons they created the center was to allow a vehicle in which you could continue to partner on different projects. And you could continue to be a member. And it's like, oh, well, this year we're doing insider threat, but next year we might be doing iOS security of some kind. Like, do you want to stick around for that? It was sort of, so I think it is intended, especially MITRE Ingenuity, which was spun up specifically to work with private industry, unlike MITRE Mothership, which is like all government, single customer kind of stuff. It's meant to be that nexus point of, you can get these rigorously academic researchers and engineers on your side to tackle wider industry problems that no one company is either empowered enough to do, or has the skills to do, or can make the business case to do, and you can bring these teams together. It's really kind of a very cool idea and mission, I think.
Oh, it is. It's been very effective, I think. Very effective. Mm-hmm. I mean, what else do we have besides CIS, Center for Net Security? I'd say that's it, right? From a community perspective, what other community? Oh, WASP, maybe.
There's a NIST. There's a lot of ISACs, right?
Yeah, but they're kind of. I worked for an ISAC. Don't get me wrong. So this isn't a negative.
But they're ISAC, right? That was the
right.
Multi-state ISAC.
Multi-state ISAC.
Actually, there's a lot of great like nonprofit, organizations and initiatives out there. This is just a really interesting one. As far as actually, what I meant to say earlier, Sam, because you brought up like people need to get paid, is like the thing is, this is really an organization that can only work with other organizations, and part of that is kind of speaking to that point, which is like money doesn't have to be like fiendishly profit driven, but it can also be like, well, people also need to pay their bills, and they need to fill these hours. And one of the nice things about the center's membership structure, not that sounds like a shameless plug, but it really is like you can actually bring in these researchers, as part of their job. As part of their day-to-day job. And I've seen a lot of really wonderful volunteer efforts out there, open source and things like that. But like, there's always the question of like, if it's unpaid as pure and, and thoughtful as it might be, it's going to always slide down the list of priority.
Yeah. Open source often has trouble keeping up, right?
Well, it's Log4j, right?
Yeah. And OpenSSL, when it had issues way back, was very, very difficult for it to keep up. No denigration meant, but when you have full-time employees and you can actually pay them, then you can put SLAs around it, right?
What? So, like, the world's built on open source,
right? When it's at that, I know I keep referencing XKCD, but like that one little tiny like wooden brick at the bottom of the foundation. That's two guys in Nebraska,
one holding it up. Yeah. Awesome.
Doing it for fun.
It's funny. I think web service calls and APIs and embedded components are really the new supply chain. Right. Much more so than the vendor contracts even. And yes, people talk about, SBOMs and stuff, but really understanding what is passing through those gates. And identities and data and the power to take action through them is a really big deal, because it's not really a supply chain anymore. It's more of a supply fabric, right?
Right.
It's not just a cascade like a line of dominoes. There's a web of influence that goes out.
It's like a World Wide Web.
Yeah. A World Wide Web. We should coin that. That's the thing we should do. Yeah.
No, I can only imagine that AI is going to make that even more impenetrable, and I can't wait to find the cascading failure that happens because people are just drawing from libraries, without.
Is there anything in history to pull from? I'm racking my brain as a non-historian who's terrible at history. Right.
For which part of that?
Yeah. For like a fabric like this. So a lot of things that we can, in general, in business and society, you can look back at history and say, this has happened 400 times before.
I think the transition
supply chain collapse probably, supply chain collapse of any kind, would probably be one of the closest. Like, I
think you can find an ecosystem collapse. We're only now beginning to understand, for instance, that actually mycology is really important, and fungus. Like it was super trippy, but I just saw a special on fungus, and apparently in a forest.
No pun intended there. Super trippy.
Yeah, I know. Like psilocybin and stuff. No, but the point is that the mushrooms and fungus are actually in most forests and jungles actually connect trees, and they exchange. They exchange things like nutrients among trees, and they help with an immune system across a whole ecosystem. And they actually help, believe it or not, with communication. It's like a network. It's like a web. And we never really understood that. So when you go plant a junk forest and you just plop trees in the ground, it doesn't kind of work. And so there's probably some analogies to this in nature. And when you kill off part of it, or you have part of it that loses genetic diversity, for instance, and you get cascading failure, and certainly probably some of the great extinctions that have occurred, although it's really hard to understand and examine them. Hey, we might be on the verge of watching one, right?
Feels like in my office today.
I'm sure there's a less grim one that we can find, but we are talking about failure, so maybe not.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really interesting perspective, because for humans, there's never been a time where we've built something that's so interreliant on components that no one maintains, no one thinks about, right? Like the internet works every day based on code.
It's certainly orders of magnitude more complex in terms of number of transactions, I think.
And components.
Complexity, yeah.
There's nothing like it that we've ever done.
Maggie, did I see a skeptical look, or are you thinking?
I'm thinking.
You can disagree with us.
As Sam knows, and I feel like this is a worthy time to bring it up, my undergraduate thesis was on the collapse of the Bronze Age.
I know.
Perfect. So we need to keep.
Which I'm a big history buff. Yeah, and
1170 something, right? It was. There's still argument over what year it was, I think, isn't there?
Yes.
1177 versus 70.
1177 BCE by Eric Klein is probably the book I would recommend to people.
I love that book.
Yeah.
By the way. I was so disappointed because as I was reading it, I was like, I've still got like 40% to go. And then I realized 30% of the book was just citations. And I reached the end and I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea how complex these civilizations were and how much was left in stone and in writings in stone and I guess petroglyphs, but like letters written in stone among Acadians or clay and Egyptians and what have you. And how much was probably left in other forms that we just don't have. But now I'm going to let you talk because you know.
Can you define like the actual age too for me, for someone who can't retain dates for the life of them, like where we are?
Around the time that you would normally think Homer was doing his thing.
400 years before him, actually.
Yeah. All right. So before him. Yeah.
That's like saying nowadays is Shakespeare's day. That's how different. That's how far apart it is.
So it's like 800 years before the
1200 years before the birth of Christ. So we're talking 1200 BCE. Before Common Era, if we're going to be academic about it. So what got me fascinated so this is basically 1200 years BC, so 3,200 years ago. There was a thriving civilization that covered the Mediterranean, stretching from, with trade routes that stretched all the way from the Baltic to Egypt. And, probably from the Straits of Gibraltar all the way to, the Levant. Which is Israel, so today.
And beyond. Into Fertile Crescent and stuff.
So then And this is an incredibly interconnected world. The kings in Greece are sending letters back and forth to the kings in Turkey. Egypt is talking to Crete. Hittites and the Egyptians are fighting all the time. That's the people in Turkey, and the people in Egypt are fighting all the time. So the art is very sophisticated. This is the period where, if it had happened historically, the Iliad and the Odyssey took place.
And much more trade than we thought. Like it was like a boat had parts from all these different regions rather than being built locally, which was what people assumed.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned the Baltic, because like amber from the Baltic has been found in like Greece. And then within about a generation, the whole thing collapsed. And in Greece specifically, literacy was not recovered. Literacy was lost and was not recovered for 400 years. It was absolutely apocalyptic, like on the level of like the Roman Empire collapse. Egypt never was the only country left standing, more or less, with any sort of continuity. They were never the same again. They never regained their power. This is like the Egypt of Ramses kind of like ended. And they were always sort of limping along. The Hittites were gone. Their traditional enemy was gone, wiped out. And it's just basically like the lights going out all over Europe. Like that's
it was a dark age. Yeah.
It was a dark age. It was a very deep dark age. Greek came back. Written Greek came back, but it was a totally different alphabet. They started over all over. And so it's a very like fascinating thing. So you hear about this and you're like, wow, this is like the end of the world. And you go, what caused it? Right? Natural question. What caused it? No one knows. Genuinely, no one knows.
There's a lot of hypotheses, from climate change.
There's a lot of hypotheses
to cascading failure in a globalized economy. Yes. And then there's the sea peoples, right?
And then there's the sea peoples who are the most
programmed only in sea. That was their thing. But there's a whole bunch of stupidity about, well, who were they? We don't even know, right? It's
a wonderful question.
Refugees.
Yeah, there's a bazillion, and we could talk about this. I could talk about this quite literally for hours. I wrote a thesis on it. The reason I was interested is because I'm also like an English, person as well, a writer. And I wanted to know, like, does this have anything to do with the Trojan War? And my conclusion was, it's probably the generation right after. So if you want to be romantical and make like a story out of it, these guys went off to the Trojan War. While they're gone, or right after they come back, society collapses. And either they come home to nothing, which is kind of attested to in some of the, stories that come out of that time, or they're like Telemachus and the children of Odysseus and all those people. Like those are the people who had to deal with it, which is also kind of attested to. There's a thing called the Sons of Hercules. Anyway, no one knows. That's the thing. And you talk to a Greece expert and they'll say, oh, it's probably this other country where the sea peoples came from. You talk to a Turkey expert and they'll say it was probably Greece. And you talk to an Egypt expert and they'll say it was probably Turkey. And you talk to a Turkey expert and they say it was definitely not Turkey. And no one knows. And it was the wildest like mystery to track down, where like every single expert says that everybody else's expertise field is where this thing originated. And all the people of those fields would say, no, it wasn't us. So it's like a crazy thing. To your point, though, one of the things that might have contributed are collapse of the tin trade, because bronze is made with 90% copper, 10% tin. There's no sources of tin in the Mediterranean that we know of. Mm-hmm. And it may have dried up. Why did it dry up? We don't really know, but when that happened, society... It
came from like Afghanistan and like Britain and places.
It could have come from Britain. It could have come from a mine in northern Turkey, which was totally tapped, ancient world. Or it could have come from like Assyria, which like all these trade routes are huge trade routes. We're talking, this is Bronze Age. It's still a long time ago. And one other theory, when the Eric Klein puts forth, is there might have been a massive climate event, a massive drought. And that might have disrupted people up, say, like in the steppe or something like that, people further out, so far outside the Mediterranean that they don't know why this is happening. And that might have created a cascade that might have disrupted, say, the tin trade, among other things. And that might have been like, so things start getting like a little bit tense in the Mediterranean. Maybe that's why you go and invade Troy, because suddenly you can't get bronze and your usual stuff anymore, but like it's not desperate yet, but maybe you're just like hurting a little bit more. And then within a generation, the whole thing falls apart. And no one's ever seen it.
By the way, just for anyone who's listening, highly recommend 1177 BC, Eric Klein. I just wish his name was Derek Klein, because then it would be Decline.
Oh, and that would the decline and fall, yeah. That would be great.
It would be so much cooler if that was true. But
so this incredibly roundabout way, to get back to Jacob's point that I was sort of looking skeptical about, which is like, has the world ever been so interwoven? Well, we've got trade today that would probably collapse if one key element went away, or if there was a massive drought. I would say you interact with an incredibly complex system every day. It's called your local grocery store. That's bringing in things from all over the world, some of which, if they broke down, I think you would keenly feel very quickly, as many people did with shortages during COVID. That would be a shuddering shock to the system, COVID, and imagine, if those things truly break, what happens. I think you'll find out just how much you're dependent on things from thousands of miles away. And you'll probably feel it in your grocery store first. One reason I think that we probably can't ever seriously go to war with China is because all the chips are still manufactured in Asia. This is a problem that's been there since I first came into this field in 2010. The first security conference I ever went to had an entire huge section of the talks at Iokawa about what are we going to do about the fact we don't make chips here in the U.S. We cannot meet demand, period.
Although they are building new fabs and they're coming online in the West now.
Yeah, but that'll be 25 years.
Before they that, but it's not here yet.
Yeah.
It's
at best, I would even argue it's not even just chips, though. It's our toys. When I say toys, I mean whatever plastic doodah, house decoration.
Oh, yeah.
We're such in the U.S., we're such a consumer society now that as soon as you lose that, you feel like you lose part of you. You felt like you lost part of society because people's identities are how they decorate. They are the things they own, not who they are.
I mean, people complain about fast fashion, for example, but it's like you don't even understand what it was like before fast fashion. Like, when there's this really poignant picture from like World War II, which is like a kid like clutching a pair of shoes to his chest. He looks like he's like 6 years old, and it's like heartrending. But it's not the war that meant he couldn't buy shoes. It was like just the shortages, like that. But like not having shoes,
couldn't buy shoes
was like just a thing, for poverty before things like fast fashion, before this global supply chain.
My parents in post-war Britain, my dad was in London, and he said there was a ration for chocolate, right? And certain kinds of food you could get meat, but it was Spam. Like that's how it arrived for a while. And shortages were normal. And so it was a big deal to get an extra Hershey bar or something.
Oh yeah. I mean, just imagine, the richest of the world in the, 15, 16, 1700s, they weren't eating any foods that were out of season. You couldn't have strawberries when it wasn't June, even if you were the king of England. It just wasn't done. You just couldn't do it. Or meat, like meat was incredibly rationed. Most, historical dishes have like a little sprinkling of meat. Like meat is very expensive to make, and we take it totally for granted. There's things that have changed in the last 100 years because of our supply chains that like, I don't think people even fully appreciate. Like I was looking up the purchasing power versus inflation are completely different things. A person who's like a servant in the early 1800s in England, like a pair of gloves just bought off a shelf would probably cost more than like their monthly salary. Just like what we would consider an almost like, oh crap, I left mine at home. I'll just grab a pair off the shelf. Like that's
I'll buy another pair tomorrow.
Yeah.
So that raises the issues. As we digitize more and more things, we are exposing more and more of our supply chain, right? I mean, our literal supply chains. And we talked about supply chains in a digital sense, but our physical supply chains are becoming accessible to hackers. Right. And
what was it? Was it MERS? The MERS incident?
Yeah, incident. That was actually where my brain was going. Yeah, which is WannaCry, right? That was WannaCry.
That was WannaCry. Yeah.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And hugely painful. But take a look at NotPetya.
No, that's NotPetya, not WannaCry.
Well, yeah, NotPetya actually hit through MITRE, which was a financial application for tax purposes in Ukraine. Right.
Yeah,
it was actually destructionware.
Yeah.
Built on Petya base, I think. That's why it was called NotPetya. I'd have to ask him. We had him on recently, actually.
Yeah.
But
that seems so long ago, but it really wasn't.
It really wasn't.
And it's part of this Ukraine war arc in all technicality. And
which has been going on for 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the war with Ukraine obviously has almost reached its 10th year, which is 2014 is when that kicked off in Donbass and all that.
If you think of it changing form from the invasion of Crimea then to a coldish to a digital, right?
Yeah, that's different. You could reboot Sherlock Holmes today, and you could still have John Watson fight in Afghanistan and in Crimea, which is the two places he fought in Sherlock Holmes. I want to say,
that says something, doesn't it?
Yeah, something. Anyway, yeah.
Well, hundreds of years don't change wars. If history is the one thing I do know about history is that no matter what, hundreds of years don't change wars.
So, Meg, you kind of hinted at the fact that you're a writer.
Yes.
And I've always known that about you. And I wonder, do you think, like in narrative form, do you think of stories in the back of your head? I know that you are always thinking about lots of things at once, but are you also thinking in terms of plots and themes and stories, or do you feel a need to write it down? Or is it just sort of passing through? I guess what I'm asking is, do you feel the pain of an author and the need to express, or is it natural in your thinking process?
There's a few ways to answer that. One, I would say, basically, one, being a writer is giving yourself homework for the rest of your life. Two, if you can at all quit, you should. But most people who are doing it, it's because they physically can't. But at the same time, it did me a great service when I decided I wanted to be a writer when I was young, because it made me start noticing things and putting them together. And I would say it's less that I think in terms of stories, what is a story in that definition, but and more around motives.
Check off. I meant narrative arc.
Yeah. Motives and the way people justify to themselves. And one of my entry points into understanding the threat actors in ransomware, right, was seeing how they were similar to pirates. But part of that too was I was really curious about how do they see themselves.
I love that perspective you had. I think you called them privateers. Yeah,
privateers is probably more accurate. The reason I brought that up was because the nation, I think, calling them criminals or pirates or even hackers is obfuscating how closely tied to nation states.
I still won't think of Conti as Sir Francis Drake. I won't do it. No.
As Francis Drake. Oh, Francis Drake is that would be a poor. But the okay, I'm straying towards that new topic, but I will just quickly say so it's around motive. So a lot of these guys Conti or Darkside rather, they said we're thieves, but we're honest thieves when they hacked Colonial Pipeline. We never meant to start an actual critical infrastructure incident. And whether or not you believe them, because they are criminals, it was very interesting that they were telling themselves the same stories that privateers and pirates of the 1700s were also telling themselves, which is we're just honest pirates. Please don't come down on us like the wrath of God, oh nation state that we just accidentally tripped over while trying to steal your stuff. And the reason that they would make those claims to pirates was because they would come after them like the wrath of God and kill them if they could get their hands on them.
And they did, yeah.
And they did. In many cases, which I don't recommend today. But there are some terrifying parallels.
Barbary pirates, yeah.
Yeah, especially when people start talking about letters of marque. It's oh boy, I don't know if you actually want to open up that can of worms. It took roughly 250 years to put it away again once you let it out. So I don't know if you want to do that.
Yeah. So do you still write? I mean, so I have a problem, which is whenever I relax, I wake up and go, I should write that down. And I have a thought. And that's why I publish an article a week, because it's Saturday morning. I go, I need to go write. Because when I don't have to do something, I have to be writing. It just pushes me. Do you have, is it like that for you?
Yeah, I would say so. I'm what you call pre-pro, which is I write a lot and then I choke before submitting it. So I just have to
I used to do that. And then I gave it to you instead.
Yes.
I would write an article and I'd be like, hey, Maggie, am I completely idiotic with this? And then you would fix it.
Sometimes you just need a second pair of eyes and a bit of encouragement. Honestly, it's more I just can't stop talking, I think, is the problem. So yes, all of this needs to go somewhere.
Yeah, but it's worth hearing, Maggie. You say good things.
What type of writing do you generally, personally, forget work, forget everything, security, but if you're just writing for yourself, do you submit to literary magazines? Do you write just things, poetry? Writing is such a broad topic, and we start top.
Mostly I write fanfic, so I won't never tell you where that is or where you can find it. But
you have a pseudonym. You don't have to tell us what it is. Do you have
I do have a pseudonym, and I have like many kids online. I have a second identity, which you will never ever know about if I know you in any professional capacity, and I have two identities online.
I think I know one of them, but I'm not going to out you.
Yeah, but I mean, you might. But I mean, and it makes it sound much more dark than it is. It's really just if I'm going to tweet about my favorite movie, I'm just not going to do it on the account that I talk about ransomware on. It's just, I just don't want people seeing me fangirl about a Marvel movie in the same place where I'm being sort of nominally professional. So yes, I have an identity I've had since I was a kid where I just talk about movies and stuff. And that's kind of the name I would keep it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. I used to really try to keep my personal nerdy habits separate from my work persona. And there was a time when I think people would really have thought less of me, but the more I bring it in, the more I think people appreciate it now. So I actually went to a conference in Chicago recently, and Rich Rushing came up from Motorola, and he had a shirt on that said "Chaotic Stupid." Right?
Oh man! Shirt, right? I would have lawful stupid on mine because I actually play paladins a lot.
I'm chaotic neutral.
So my dad played a paladin recently, right? The guy who used to wonder when I was in high school if this was going to corrupt me and turn me to demonology, suddenly he's turned around at 75 and said, "Hey, what is that game you were playing?" Yeah.
I started playing paladins as like a joke. I was like, I was so annoyed by how often they were played as lawful stupid. I was like, this can be done better, guys. Like, it's possible to play one without them being just like the worst.
Yeah, there's more than one mold for this.
Yeah, and then I looked back and I had played like 3 paladins in a row, and it was not a joke. It's like saying when you start saying "dude" ironically, and then it becomes part of your vocabulary. It's like, I'll play a paladin ironically, and I'll play it right, and then now all I do is play paladins.
So we've established fanfic as one of your forms. Do you have other forms? I know Jacob just suggested. Was there poetry there? Is there non-fic? Is there?
I did write a play once. With a colleague, with a co-writer who knew more about writing plays than me. So I teamed up with him to learn how to write plays. And it got shown once, and then like the theater where it was supposed to put on like got flooding damage, and it just sort of fell by the wayside. I believe he's trying to.
But it went all the way from writing to production, which is insane.
Yeah, full like costumed reading, and like it was really fascinating to see because there's things in prose, for example, that don't work on stage. So like you'll have your big. You remember when Spider-Man was first made into a movie, and like they were like, "Oh, we tried to make him quippy, but we couldn't because like he's dancing his back." Web slinging all over the place. It's really hard to make these jokes. They work in comic form because you can just put a panel and have all the words, but he can't actually say, if he were actually moving, he wouldn't be able to make this joke. Unless he just froze and everyone just let him freeze for a bit. And that was one thing. So like we had a big monologue or something during the climax, and everything just stopped dead while this monologue happened. And we realized like, this is so awkward. And we never realized how long the speech was while they're supposed to be like kind of under attack and yet not like, but the enemy like not bursting through the door. So like we had to, and we never would have seen it if we hadn't staged it. Like, and it was fascinating to see like how the timing worked once it was read aloud and not at a tape. The table reading did not reveal this, by the way, because the table reading, it was just still people sitting around. It seemed perfectly reasonable that we sort of duck out of reality time for a second to talk about, whatever the characters were talking about.
Did you?
And then we found a way to make
write
it work.
that?
Yeah. What we ended up doing was we shortened it a bit, and then it's a play about werewolves in the Old West, and we decided that the two people who are having the conversation are barring the door, like with their shoulder, like trying to keep it from like busting in the door, and that added tension to the dialogue. It allowed the person who was playing the werewolf actually time to like put the costume on. So we could just have any old stagehand just like banging on the door, and that gave this person like the freedom to go away and do their costume change and the time to like let these people have this much more tense and much more like scary talk because there's like actually like somebody trying to bash down the door beside. But in the original, it was just kind of like them standing there in front of a locked door. Like, so anyway, I philosophically disagree with you. And it was just like, I was like, ooh, it was like just record scratched or brakes squealing, just everything stopped.
You can say record scratch. It's not too dated.
No. I just meant like, I was trying to think of the right, but it really, what it really felt like was, I don't know if you've ever skied, but like if you ski over snow and then suddenly hit like a mud patch and you just go, you just completely like stop. And that's what it felt like that when we hit that scene.
You lost all the momentum.
All momentum stopped, and it was crazy.
So I gotta ask, how did you come to werewolves in the West? Like,
can I call the podcast "Werewolves in the West"?
Werewolves in the West.
Episode
That'd
name
be great.
That sounds like awesome.
My co-writer's previous story had been like a reimagining of Dracula, and we were trying to build something from scratch. So we were like, let's just go through the movie monsters, and let's pick the most interesting one, and then let's find a way to do it differently than everyone else has done it. So we ended up, after vampires, obviously werewolves is next. So we went to werewolves, and then we were like, well, they're always used as like a puberty metaphor. That's Teen Wolf, right? Like you're getting hair in weird places and your voice is changing and and sexuality is scary. Like that's kind of what it always was. And we're like, well, what can we do with this? And we decided to do a disease, a plague. And like where lycanthropy had been, we imagined an alternate Old West where the Civil War was in this world was ground to a halt by a trench disease that some people thought was like deliberately an attack. Some people thought it might have been like a super soldier program. Nobody really knew if it was meant to be defensive or offensive. And it just spread like wildfire. And like these horrific draconian measures needed to be used to contain it. And we're out in this like sleepy town out in Montana, basically, that never got touched by any of this.
And then it arrives.
And well, there's a wolf sighting, and they don't know whether or not it's like a werewolf or a normal wolf, but everyone's kind of freaking out. Act 1 was modeled off of Gilgamesh. So Act 1 was supposed to be that they go, this woman from this wood fur trapper lady comes into town, and that's Anketu, and like she was gonna team up with our protagonist, who's the sheriff, and they're gonna go hunt this wolf, and they're gonna find it, and they're gonna kill it. And so it's like a buddy cop, the Act 1, and then Act 2 is
does it follow the same arc as Gilgamesh? With eventually they're together, or
Anketu dies, but no, Act 2 is like that was just to kind of get us to Act 2, and Act 2 is going to be the town descending of eating itself alive, basically, as like it became much more the Crucible. If Act 1 was Gilgamesh, Act 2 is the Crucible because nobody knows.
I want to see this.
Yeah, it was a fun play, but I would say it resonates more after COVID. It resonates a lot more after COVID because it's all about people like kind of not know where this disease comes from, and like remote areas thinking they're safe, and then like people turning on one another, and so it's almost more topical now in very spooky ways.
So I know you're always thinking a mile a minute. What do you do, if anything, to relax or to calm down? Is there anything, or is that just overrated?
I play The Sims. I'm an original Sims kid.
Nice.
Yeah. That's probably the only thing I do where I can shut my brain off. That's probably
so. It. Yeah, the Sims. There's so many different variants on it, but my daughter got into it, and I found my daughter and my son, who are 7 and 10, playing The Sims on my the work one. It's crazy. I'm like, what are you doing? They're like, we're trying to keep this family alive. I was like, it's awesome.
Yeah, it's not. It's I try to tell people not to play Sims the same way I tell people not to take up smoking. Like, save yourself.
That's right.
But yeah, no, it's I don't know. That's a terrifying question. What do you do to relax?
Yeah, it's one of those things that's really. I know that it can change too, right? Sometimes it's going to be gaming, or it's going to be writing, or it's going to be playing a video game or whatever.
Mindlessly scrolling social media.
Where
we're going to do that though, I don't know. Because I'm as a millennial, I'm on like 56th social media platform, I think, roughly, with Twitter sort of imploding, and then like 6 copycats springing up over the weekend. Hopefully in a month, this will be old news and you won't even know what I'm talking about.
Exactly. So Jacob, anything else you wanted to dive into?
I think there's so many things that we could talk about. And I think that one of them, though, is we should talk more about role-playing and tabletop at some point. But I think we leave it for a second live episode where we get together in person.
And actually do it? Oh, geez. Wow. It doesn't go as well. I heard, this is going to sound terrible, but most of the online role-playing that you see people do is usually actually scripted, is what I've heard. So like, a lot of the shows that have become very popular with this, but because most of when you get together with your friends and do this, it's very impromptu. And I don't know how good it is as a spectator sport, but I'm game. I think there'd be a lot of editing involved to make it seem more interesting for a spectator.
Yeah.
So something like a 4 or 5 hours for us turns into half an hour that's interesting for other people.
Right. Yeah, I was a big fan.
I think we'd have to pick something small, and we'd have to do a multi-camera, so you can do quick cuts between people and reactions to how things. So it'd be a lot more editing. It's something I'd probably put up on Fiverr and have an editor actually do the cut for us. But I think it'd be fun to do like we rent a couple cameras and do a multi-camera.
That's the other thing. Who else do we involve?
There was, in fact, a Discord server made for cyber reason gamers that never amounted to anything. Where will we find gamers in the cybersecurity world?
There's
more and fewer than you'd think. More and less than you'd think.
No, actually, it's right around the 1 hour mark, and we're definitely going to have you back. So, and by the way, Jacob's a wizard with editing, so some of this he'll probably remove.
Sure.
We'll see. But
not my precious
Maggie,
words.
thank you for joining us. It's been great to have you on, and we're definitely going to have you back. I think if we got into some of the longer subjects, we'd be here for another hour easily. But I really appreciate you coming and spending time with Jacob and I.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm loving your podcast and really feel fortunate to have been invited on just to get the chance to talk to you guys.